The United States is now moving toward what may become the second and potentially most devastating wave of its blockade operation in the Strait of Hormuz. If this next phase unfolds the way current deployments suggest, the message from Washington is unmistakable. The era of warnings is ending, and the era of enforced control may be beginning. For years, Iran treated Hormuz as a pressure point, a bargaining chip, a narrow maritime choke point it could threaten whenever regional tension rose. But now the United States appears ready to answer that pressure with overwhelming force. Not symbolic force, not limited deterrence. A full-spectrum naval, air, amphibious, and mine-clearing architecture designed to dominate the strait from the surface, from the air, and from beneath the water. And if this buildup continues on its current path, Hormuz may soon stop being a zone of strategic ambiguity and become a battlefield of absolute military control. At the center of this surge is one of America's most powerful maritime assets, the USS George H. W. Bush. After departing Norfolk, navigating around the African continent, and passing the Strait of Gibraltar, the carrier has reportedly locked its course directly toward the Gulf crisis zone. This is not just a ship entering a tense region. It is a floating air force, a mobile fortress, and a strategic signal visible across multiple continents. On its flight deck sits what amounts to the striking power of a small country. More than 70 F/A, 18 Super Hornets, EA, 18G Growler electronic warfare aircraft, 2 Hawkeye early warning platforms, Seahawk helicopters, and nearly 5,000 personnel. That combination gives the United States the ability to conduct air patrols, surveillance, electronic attack, close support, defensive screening, and rapid strike operations almost continuously once the carrier is fully integrated into the wider naval posture. And according to the scenario laid out in this script, the Bush is moving in to support the USS Abraham Lincoln, positioned east of the Strait of Hormuz, roughly 200 kilometers south of the Iranian coastline. But 2 aircraft carriers are only the visible core of a much larger military equation. Around Hormuz, more than 15 highly advanced warships are described as already positioned on high alert, forming a layered naval shield around the crisis area. Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyers, Ticonderoga-class cruisers, amphibious assault ships, and replenishment vessels are all part of the force package gathering in and around the Arabian Sea. This is what makes the deployment so consequential. A carrier alone is a statement. A carrier backed by cruisers, destroyers, logistical sustainment ships, mine-clearing assets, marine expeditionary elements, and maritime patrol aircraft is not merely a statement. It is operational preparation. The destroyers are scanning the waters and monitoring the Iranian coast with intense precision. The cruisers extend the reach of air and missile defense. The amphibious ships bring a different kind of pressure entirely, because they suggest that Washington is not only preparing to control the sea lanes, but also preserving the option to seize, raid, or strike selected coastal threats if events spiral further. That is why the marine component matters so much. The nearly 3,500 troops of the 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit, backed by MV-22 Osprey tiltrotor aircraft, are reportedly poised in the Arabian Sea. They are not there for ceremony. They are there because they represent fast, flexible, expeditionary force projection. They can board vessels, secure infrastructure, raid launch sites, reinforce threatened naval positions, or participate in limited littoral operations with little warning. Added to this is the 11th Marine Expeditionary Unit, numbering nearly 2,500 personnel and advancing toward the Middle East. When you add those forces together, you begin to understand the scope of what is building. This is not simply a transit operation. It is a maritime pressure system with airborne assault options embedded inside it. The presence of both MEUs means the United States is not relying on a single layer of deterrence. It is preparing for escalation pathways ranging from patrol and interdiction all the way to direct coastal intervention if that becomes necessary. Then there is the invisible threat that may matter more than anything else in a narrow choke point like Hormuz: mines. The shallow waters of the strait are uniquely vulnerable to mine warfare, and Iran has long understood that naval mines can impose enormous costs on a more powerful enemy. That is why U.S. mine-clearing assets are now such a central part of the operation. Minesweepers moving westward from the Pacific, reportedly departing from bases in Japan and advancing through the Strait of Malacca toward the Middle East, are part of a quieter but equally important phase of the buildup. Their mission is not glamorous, but it may be decisive. If the United States intends to keep the channel open for selected traffic while denying Iran the ability to weaponize the seabed, then clearing, mapping, and monitoring the underwater battle space becomes just as important as controlling the skies above it. This is where P-8 Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft enter the picture. Constantly circling overhead, these aircraft are not just looking for ships. They are listening for anomalies, tracking patterns, and helping identify threats below the surface. Their sonar-supported detection capabilities, combined with aerial surveillance and real-time data sharing, make them critical to early warning and maritime domain awareness. In a place as narrow and strategically sensitive as Hormuz, awareness is everything. A mine, a drone, a speedboat swarm, a mobile missile launcher, or an unusual maritime maneuver can all have strategic consequences if detected too late. The U.S. system is clearly being built to prevent surprise, compress reaction times, and ensure that any Iranian move is seen before it can become a fait accompli. That is why this second wave feels different from a traditional show of force. It is not only projecting power, it is constructing control, and the immediate effects of that control are already visible in the narrative described here. According to the latest field reports cited in the script, exactly 10 commercial vessels facing the blockade were forced to abandon their routes and turn back toward Iranian ports. 2 Iranian crude oil tankers trying to depart from Chabahar were reportedly intercepted by the Arleigh Burke-class destroyer USS Spruance. The radio warning said everything. The message was clear, formal, and harsh. Iranian ports and coastal areas were under blockade. Outbound ships were advised to return to port. Vessels inbound to Iran were told not to proceed, and any attempt to breach the blockade would carry consequences. That moment, if accurately represented, marked the first unmistakably concrete sign that Washington's second phase operation was moving from posture into active enforcement. It was no longer about signaling intent. It was about shaping maritime behavior in real time. The operational picture in the first 24 hours makes the severity of the situation even more striking. With over 10,000 U.S. personnel and dozens of naval vessels involved in effectively locking down the strait, the number of ships able to pass through that specific blockade environment was described as 0. That matters for 2 reasons. First, it shows the degree of military pressure the United States is capable of applying in an extremely narrow maritime corridor. Second, it reveals that Washington is trying to calibrate that pressure rather than impose indiscriminate regional paralysis. According to the narrative, neutral commercial shipping headed to non-Iranian ports has been left untouched. In other words, the operation is not being presented as a shutdown of all Gulf trade. It is being framed as a selective effort aimed specifically at Iranian-linked maritime movement, especially movement that could finance, sustain, or shield Tehran's military posture. CENTCOM has already signaled that mine clearance operations have begun, and with destroyers pushing the first phase forward, underwater drones and specialized clearance systems are now shaping what comes next. But if the United States is building a machine for control, Iran is trying to build a machine for disruption. Over the past 48 hours in this narrative, military activity on the Iranian side of the strait has visibly intensified. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy is not trying to match the United States ship for ship. It never was. Its doctrine has always been built around asymmetry, speed, dispersion, harassment, and escalation through low-cost tools that impose high-cost reactions. Iran's concept is brutally simple. Do not defeat the U.S. Navy in a classical naval battle. Instead, surround it with so many small, fast, cheap, and persistent threats that every operation becomes expensive, every hour becomes tense, and every Western government begins asking whether the strait is worth the risk. That is why the buildup of small craft along the Iranian shore is so significant. It signals not weakness, but doctrinal consistency. Hundreds of Iranian speedboats are reportedly patrolling the strait, especially in the most sensitive sectors. Bagamar-class armed boats carrying machine guns and rocket launchers are described shadowing U.S. destroyers at speeds of 40 to 50 knots. Ashura and Tundra-class attack craft are designed for swarm tactics, small, agile, mass-produced, and ideally suited for coordinated harassment attacks in confined waters. Global intelligence estimates in the script placed between 600 and 800 Iranian speedboats in the Hormuz region. That number alone explains why even a superpower cannot approach this theater casually. One speedboat is a nuisance. A coordinated wave of dozens or hundreds becomes a saturation problem. It forces commanders to identify intent quickly, distinguish surveillance from attack, and decide whether to fire before a threat becomes lethal. In a waterway only 33 kilometers wide at its narrowest point, that decision window can shrink dangerously fast. That danger already appeared to surface on April 11th, when the USS Frank E. Peterson Jr. and USS Michael Murphy were reportedly transiting the strait, and Iranian Revolutionary Guard naval elements attempted to swarm the two destroyers within minutes. Warning messages were exchanged. The U.S. ships held course. Washington insisted that it was operating in accordance with international law and rules of engagement. But moments like that are exactly why the second wave now looks so explosive. If the United States has indeed decided to reinforce its presence with more carriers, more aircraft, more Marines, and more mine-clearing assets, it is because leaders in Washington seem to believe the next encounter may not remain limited to radio calls and close shadowing. The more crowded the battle space becomes, the more likely a misjudgment becomes. And Iran's threat architecture does not stop at speedboats. The skies over Hormuz are becoming just as dangerous as the waters below. The script claims there are now more than 200 active Iranian surveillance and attack drones in the region, including Shahid, 136 loitering strike variants, Mohajer, 6, and Mohajer, 10 long-range surveillance platforms, and small FPV suicide drones. That mix matters because it reflects layered drone warfare. Some systems observe, some identify targets, some strike directly. Others participate in swarm attacks or act as attritional tools intended to draw out expensive defensive interceptors. That may be one of the most serious operational risks facing any U.S. second-phase action in Hormuz. A destroyer can defend itself against isolated aerial threats. But defending against repeated, cheap, coordinated UAV pressure over time becomes a cost and inventory challenge as much as a tactical one. That is precisely the kind of warfare Iran wants to impose. The United States has already shown that it can respond. During the April 11th tension spike described in the script, U.S. forces reportedly destroyed an Iranian surveillance drone. That suggests Washington is willing to act when it believes a platform crosses a threshold from observation into operational threat. But drone warfare in the Strait is not just about individual shoot-downs. It is about tempo. If Iran launches persistent surveillance and periodic swarms, it can force the United States to stay at a permanently elevated alert state, burning attention, missiles, and flight hours. Every drone launched may cost Tehran relatively little. Every defensive action taken by Washington consumes time, money, and finite intercept capacity. That imbalance is central to Iran's strategy. The most dangerous part of the picture, however, may still be underwater. Reuters sources cited in the script claim that Revolutionary Guard elements have laid dozens of mines in the Strait, and that nearly 6,000 naval mines are being discussed overall. If even a fraction of that number is correct, the challenge is enormous. These are not simply crude floating charges. The script refers to multiple mine types and trigger mechanisms. MDM-3 style influence mines can remain suspended and react to the acoustic or magnetic signature of passing ships. Seabed mines, described here in the MDM-7 category, can detonate beneath vessels transiting shallow water. Traditional contact mines remain lethal if physically struck. Drifting mines may be the most alarming of all, because they do not stay where they were placed. New York Times reporting referenced in the script suggests strong bottom currents in the Gulf may have already swept some of them kilometers away from their original positions. A minefield that moves is more than a hazard. It is strategic chaos. That is why U.S. mine countermeasure systems are central to the next phase. Knifefish-class autonomous underwater vehicles are designed to detect mines through sonar scanning in cluttered environments. The Mk-18 Mod 2 Kingfish unmanned underwater vehicle can map the seabed and identify hidden explosives with extraordinary precision. MH-60S Seahawk helicopters equipped with airborne laser mine detection systems can search for near-surface threats from above. And once a mine is found, expendable neutralization systems like Seafox can be sent directly at the target, destroying both the mine and themselves in the process. But even this reveals one of the great ironies of Hormuz. The script notes that a single neutralizer may cost around $100,000, while the mine it destroys may be worth as little as $2,000. That is the economics of asymmetric warfare in one brutal comparison. Iran does not need to match the United States in sophistication. It only needs to force the United States to spend heavily and continuously to maintain freedom of navigation. Now consider the geography. At its narrowest point, the Strait of Hormuz is only 33 kilometers wide. A speedboat can cover that distance in around 20 minutes. A cruise missile can cross it in minutes. A ballistic missile can threaten the space in seconds. In such a compressed environment, escalation can happen faster than diplomacy can react. The first likely scenario is continued low-intensity confrontation. A speedboat crosses a critical distance. A drone gets too close. A radar lock is interpreted as hostile preparation, and Washington decides it will no longer rely on warning shots or verbal cautions. In that case, the response could be immediate and overwhelming. F/A, 18 Super Hornets, and EA, 18G Growlers from the Abraham Lincoln could intensify the air patrol density over the strait. The Growlers could jam Iranian communications and disrupt coordination among fast attack craft. 8 Poseidons could track every vessel, drone, and coastal battery in real time. Once a target is identified as an active threat, destruction would likely follow swiftly. The second scenario is more dangerous still, a full saturation attempt by Iran. In this version of events, Tehran could launch more than 100 speedboats together with a drone swarm in a coordinated attack wave aimed at overwhelming U.S. situational awareness and missile defense capacity. The logic is simple and ruthless. Force billion-dollar platforms to expend expensive missiles and ammunition against waves of cheap targets. In such a case, the United States might turn to one of the most specialized aircraft in its arsenal for exactly this kind of target environment, the A-10 Warthog. Built for punishing light vehicles and concentrated ground targets, the A-10's 30mm GU, 8 Avenger cannon can shred small boats, coastal launch ramps, and expose strike positions with terrifying efficiency. Super Hornets could provide close support and precision attack, while A-10s handle dense boat clusters and shoreline targets. If Iran pushed even further, B-52 and B-1 bombers could be used against missile batteries, command nodes, and infrastructure deeper inland. And Iran still has another card to play in that scenario: anti-ship missiles. Coastal batteries around Bandar Abbas, Keshem Island, and Hormuz Island could fire salvos intended to force the U.S. Navy into yet another expensive defensive battle. Among the systems highlighted in the script is the Norm missile, a Chinese-origin C-802 derivative with a range of roughly 120 to 170 kilometers. In the confined geography of the strait, that is more than enough to threaten key shipping lanes and naval positions. The United States would respond with Aegis combat systems, Patriot Pack, 3 MSE batteries, THAAD, and NASAMS, all designed to form overlapping defensive layers. But even here, Iran's strategy remains the same: attrition. It wants to burn through interceptors, impose uncertainty, and keep mobile missile launchers alive by hiding them in rugged coastal terrain. Most of these launchers are truck-mounted, which means they can relocate rapidly and exploit Iran's mountainous coastline as a maze of natural firing positions and concealment zones. Yet the most unsettling possibility may not be missile exchange or swarm attack. It may be the return of a ground operation option. The script repeatedly points to forces that would make little sense if Washington intended only passive naval enforcement. Roughly 2,000 to 3,000 elite Marines, MV, 22 Ospreys, and MH, 60 Seahawk helicopters aboard the USS America and associated ships represent more than deterrence. They represent choice. If missile ramps or command centers on the Iranian coast continue threatening U.S. ships, Washington may decide that remote suppression is not enough and that selected coastal objectives must be neutralized directly. That does not necessarily mean a broad invasion, but it does mean the option of limited raids, precision assaults, or temporary seizures of tactical ground may no longer be unthinkable. A single miscalculation by either side could turn the current naval contest into a combined maritime air littoral conflict almost overnight. When all of these pieces are placed together, Washington's objective becomes much clearer. This is not only about keeping the Strait of Hormuz physically open. It is about imposing complete operational control over who uses it, how it is used, and whether Iran can continue to exploit it as an economic and military lever. The strategic end state hinted at throughout this script is not merely maritime safety. It is economic constriction. And that is where Karg Island enters the picture. According to the narrative here, roughly 90% of Iran's oil exports move through Karg. Before the war, more than 90% of Iranian oil reportedly went from Karg to China. If that line is cut, the consequences do not stop at Tehran's coastline. They extend all the way to Beijing. That is what gives this crisis its truly global dimension. Every tanker leaving Karg has represented more than oil revenue. It has represented funding for Iran's wider military machine, drones, missiles, mines, speedboats, and the infrastructure of coercion. Washington understands that severing or tightly controlling that flow would strike Iran at its financial core. But it would also create downstream consequences for China, which has depended heavily on Iranian crude. In that sense, the naval surge now taking shape is not simply pressuring Tehran. It is also warning Beijing that any attempt to shield, sustain, or outweigh Iran through energy channels may come under increasing strain if American control of Hormuz deepens. That is why this operation is so much bigger than a regional standoff. It sits at the intersection of military power, maritime law, energy security, and great power rivalry. So the true question is no longer whether Hormuz is tense. That question has already been answered. The real question is which side believes time is working in its favor. Iran thinks low-cost disruption can wear down American resolve. The United States appears to believe overwhelming force, selective blockade, and underwater clearance can deny Tehran the chaos it needs. China watches from the background, knowing its energy interests are now intertwined with a maritime confrontation it does not control. And every hour that more warships, more aircraft, and more Marines move into place, the margin for error shrinks. One mine, one drone, one speedboat, one missile battery, one panicked captain, one misread signal, and the entire balance could shift. What makes this moment so dangerous is that both sides may believe they are acting rationally. Iran sees asymmetry as survival. The United States sees escalation dominance as deterrence. But in a corridor this narrow, in a theater this crowded, rational moves can still produce irrational outcomes. That is why the second wave matters so much. It is not just another deployment. It is the moment when posture may become permanent enforcement, and enforcement may become conflict. If that happens, the Strait of Hormuz will no longer be merely the world's most sensitive energy choke point. It will become the place where the United States, Iran, and indirectly China test how far each is willing to go when maritime control, oil revenue, military credibility, and geopolitical leverage all collide at once. And if that collision comes, the consequences will not stay in the Gulf. They will move through energy markets, military alliances, shipping routes, insurance rates, political capitals, and every crisis room watching the region. Because what is assembling off Hormuz now is not just another fleet. It is a decision point, a steel wall on the water, a test of asymmetric defiance against concentrated power, and perhaps the opening act of a confrontation that could redraw the strategic map of the Middle East far faster than anyone is prepared for.